There was another one that you wanted to broach tonight, though, which was about beauty in nature.
Yeah, hang on one second. I just need to load something up.
Okie dokie. So, what do you think? Do you think nature is beautiful? Do you think certain aspects of nature are not beautiful? How do you compare what is beautiful in nature? Let us know.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting question. Okay, so with art, we have these categories that we can judge by. We can say, well, it's not cubist, and you're judging it as a cubist work. But with nature, is there anything like that that you can judge it by? Is there categories that you can put things into to say,
Well, not really. I suppose you could say maybe a beach, a nice sandy beach. If you compare a beach covered in rocks and crap versus a beautiful white sand and ocean, I mean, that tends to be, it's not necessarily a standard in the same way. Again, if the countryside, if you were talking about the countryside and it was, you know, an urban built up area with loads of pollution, you'd say, well, as the countryside, that's not good. So there are sort of descriptions for what you're expecting. You know, if you say a mountain and it's a foot high, it's not a mountain. But by definition, it's not a mountain.
that's it? There are things that we can label these things as, but then what makes a good mountain a good mountain beyond how it makes you feel looking at it?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we've got the definition of a mountain, which is a certain height that I can't remember because I haven't been in school for many years. Um,
Same.
yeah, but there is a standard of what makes a mountain a mountain. But how could we say a mountain is a good mountain or a beautiful mountain? Um, for me, again, this comes down to a level of subjectivity. If it was gloomy and filled with pollution and there was mess everywhere, um, I would say I don't find that particular scene beautiful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual mountain itself is not beautiful. It's just the crap that it's covered with. Um,
Yeah.
so that
It
one's actually quite difficult.
well, I can't remember his
He's going to
name.
show me it's not that difficult at all now, isn't
Oh
he?
no, it is. Alan Carlson makes an argument that sort of branches off Kendall Walton's. What that is that while we have these categories of art, um, we also have categories of nature as set out by science.
Hmm.
So a mountain is such and such. If you look at a mountain and say, well, that's a terrible hill, it's not a very pretty hill, it's too tall. Well, then you're not judging that mountain in the right way because it's not a hill, it's a mountain.
Hmm.
Or this still water isn't beautiful because beautiful water is stormy and rushy. There, the categories kind of fall down.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in the same way that we were talking, mate, an ocean. If you're comparing a stream to an ocean, no, that's not what it does. That's not what we're
Yeah,
talking about. But then we could say there are certain things about an ocean that do make it better. Again, we go back through the pollution one. If it's nice, clear, crisp water and you can see all the things underneath it, we would say that it is more beautiful. But then that comes down to a subjective preference that I suppose is somewhat agreed on by most people. So maybe it's a bit intersubjective, but I don't know if it's quite up to an objective standard like we would be judging art. Opie's just popped in. How you doing, buddy?
hey, Opie.
He says Japanese aesthetics is like his side hobby study. Japanese
Oh,
aesthetics,
nice. I've
interesting.
never actually studied them. I love Japanese artwork and that kind of thing, but I don't know much about it, to be honest.
No, so you're going to have to come on and fill us in with that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, nice to see you. So we've got those scientific classifications, and we can say if it fits those things. So, but that's almost an objective standard of what a mountain is, and That doesn't
rather.
really tell us whether it's beautiful as a mountain.
Yeah, it doesn't give us a standard that we can actually judge it by, just how we can judge it.
Mm.
Um, so if you imagine something like the Grand Canyon,
Hmm.
now we know that that was created by millions of years of streams cutting through it, all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
We can say, well, that's what makes it beautiful. It's, it's what nature has done to create that scenery that makes it beautiful. But again, is that truly beautiful? Does that necessarily make something beautiful? It's scientific, and there are people who appreciate nature in such a way that they might find that beautiful. But if they were to turn around to someone who says, well, I don't find it beautiful, and they say, well, you're just judging it wrong, are they judging it wrong?
Mm. And there isn't as much of a standard again. I like what you're saying about the process being a nice scientific process. It's a natural process. But then that got me thinking, well, not every natural process is, well, at least subjectively beautiful. I mean, you've seen some animals and humans give horrific births, for example, but
Yeah.
that's perfectly natural. A snake
It,
bite, you know, and
is a bug
disease.
laying eggs in a child's eyes, which then burst and pop out? Is that beautiful?
I would say no. I mean, it's doing what it does. It's natural, but does natural equate to beauty? Then we go, well, there is natural beauty when we're looking at a scene. So obviously, we're saying it's not the same thing. We're saying that there is a standard above natural that makes something beautiful. So if we have a look at a nice scenic setting where there's this sunset coming down and all that sort of thing, again, we're back to the feeling that it gives us. And that tells us what is beautiful in nature as a good sunset and all of that. But is that still wholly subjective of what we think about that? Or is there an objective standard of a good sunset in a nice scenic setting?
Yeah, exactly. So while science can give us these categories, it can't really give us the categories in the same way that Kendall Walton argues,
Mm.
which is kind of interesting. So we can then move on and say, well, there's another way to look at nature.
Hmm.
And I can't for the life of me remember whose argument this is. It's a woman's argument. But it's basically the landscape. So if you focus on, like when you see a photographer put his hands together and he focuses on a scene, you see
Hmm.
like a filmmaker do it. So that is basically called the landscape judgment, the portrait judgment, where you take a particular scene and frame and you kind of think of it in the same way that you would think of a piece of art that looks like that.
Mm.
So in, say, a landscape painting, you would judge it by how the greens look and the clearness of the sky, things like that. So that's another way that you could judge nature and say, well, perhaps that's the kind of standard that we could use.
Yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense, especially if you're comparing it to still life. You've taken a picture of a scene, and then there you've got that clear thing of, oh yeah, this is a good bit of still life. Again, there are certain scenes that do seem, I guess, a bit surreal. Some photography, they can capture something at a certain angle that makes a really weird picture or a really abstract picture. So again, you're going back into how you would judge the art sort of that way. So whilst there isn't a direct standard of beauty for nature, you can compare it to the art it looks most like, which in
Yeah.
general would be still life.
Or cinematography, something along those kind of lines. But again, does that really give us any categories that we could judge that nature by? Because it's not being created by anybody. It's just the scene that happens to be there. So if somebody says, well, I don't find that particular scene beautiful, you can't then turn and say, well, look at these brushstrokes or look at the way the cinematographer uses the light to bounce off the ground to create a richer green. There's none of that. There is just, well, that's what nature looks like.
Yeah, it is what it is. Um, one of those. The first rule of logic. Something is what it is. It can't be anything
Something, yeah,
else.
the law of identity.
Yeah, law
Yeah.
of identity. That's the one. Um, yeah, there is no additional way to really describe it. All you can do is a comparative thing. So yeah, there is no classification to or standard really within nature that you can compare it to. The best you can do is compare it to a standard of art that it is most related to, but even then, still not the same thing.
Exactly. Sorry, I'm just reading up on something.
Okay. What would you like me to do in the
Um,
meantime? Yeah.
I'm just looking at Carroll's argument, which is something akin to Carlson's argument, and it's akin to the portrait mode. So when we look at a waterfall, we can judge its beauty by, say, how much force is going into it. Well, look at how forceful it is. Look at how much water is dropping down and the cutting of the rocks and that kind of thing. That's what makes it beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
But again, does it actually make it beautiful?
Yeah, I'm still at the point where I don't think there is an objective standard for nature in the same way that we can do it with art. I think that we could use certain classifications, as I mentioned earlier, for example, like countryside. And if the countryside suddenly became a really urban, built up, polluted area, we could say, well, that's not good as countryside, but that's still not telling us whether it's beautiful or not. It's just saying it doesn't really fit the classification of what countryside is.
And you could judge all those kind of city things by architecture or layout or planning. So there are objective standards to judge an urban landscape or a suburban landscape.
Yeah, for example, you've got a Gothic style in a church sort of thing. You can actually, whether you like how churches look or not, you can compare it to this particular standard, this particular era. Yes, it ticks all the boxes for that era, but I don't. So actually, it's easier to judge unnatural things than natural. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah.
Ah, bastard humans.
We're the ones with all the skill, not nature. And you see that's joking aside, but that is one of the things that can be used to classify something as beautiful, the skill that has gone into creating that piece of work. But nothing can be said like that about nature because there is no skill, there is no artist behind how it looks.
No, you can appreciate the process of evolution and how we've got all this diverse life and all of that, but you wouldn't necessarily say the process of evolution was beautiful because it fucks up so many times. So unless evolution was absolutely perfect, I mean, if we could imagine that, then I guess we could say maybe that would be beautiful. We can say certain products of it are beautiful, but again, we're comparing that on a subjective preference rather than an objective standard of it. We could talk about the functionality of, say, a hawk and its ability to see things miles away and swoop in and, catch that mouse that it was 300 feet away or whatever. But again, would we say that that was beautiful?
That's it. If somebody turned to you and said, well, I don't find that beautiful, I just find that cruel. Can you turn around and say, well, no, it's beautiful because, in the same way that you can a painting or a bit of architecture or a bit of music, anything like that, you can't really do that. So there are categories we can use to make judgments about nature, but I wouldn't necessarily argue that these are the same kind of objective categories and standards that we can use in something man-made.
Opie just chimed in. He says people don't always consider standards for discuss or grotesque in aesthetics. So I suppose the one that jumps to my mind there is a gore film or a horror film. Um, you would say that the fact that it's making you go is what it's intended to do. So you can judge in that category, it is good at what it's doing. So it is the beauty standard of this particular piece. Um, but how else could
Yeah.
we apply that to aesthetics?
Well, if you think of something like The Thing, you know, the 1983 film, 81 film.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, I really like that. I even liked the new one as well.
Yeah, it was pretty good. But if you think about that 1981 film, there are a lot of pretty gross parts in it. But if you think of the skill that went into those special effects and how real they looked and how unique they were, you could turn around and say, well, I don't find them beautiful. And it's like, you could turn around and say, well, that's because you're not appreciating the art. It might be gross, but it's art.
mm, yeah, it's done its job. It's ticked the boxes.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
achieved its purpose. Think of something like a painting.
Mm.
When a painter creates a painting and he creates it to get a particular reaction, have you heard of the artist Damien Hirst?
I have actually, but I don't know
The,
why.
the chopped in half a cow guy.
Okay, yeah, that's why I know.
Yeah.
He was
Um,
in the news a while
he,
ago.
yeah, he created that piece of art to get a disgusting reaction. He wanted people to feel disgust at it. And he wanted people to be angry and say, that's not art. But if a part of art is creating some kind of feeling in the viewer and creating a particular feeling, then it has done its job, even if
Mm,
it's gross. And even if somebody misinterprets it and says, oh, that's disgusting, it's not art, it just makes me feel bad. Well, sometimes art is designed to make you feel bad or disgusted.
mm,
Uh, Oliver Twist is art, and it was created in its time to make you feel disgust at the living standards that some people in poverty were going through.
mm. And hopefully, with that feeling of disgust, build a appreciation for, or maybe we should do something about it so that we don't feel disgusted about it. Although I imagine the average person just goes, "I'm just going to ignore
Yeah,
it."
but art can be motivating, you know.
Definitely.
Um, so there's a lot of ways to look at art, and this is another case of objective and subjective. If you look at a piece of art and you see something other than the artist's original intent, you have taken a new meaning from it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the artist's meaning is lost. It's just that you haven't seen it.
Mm.
So there's that kind of objective standard to judge it by as well.
No, that's interesting. It's going me back to when we used to do in English literature, and you're judging various poems and things like that, and the assonance and alliteration, and the way that it's all going through. We did a lot of Wilfred Owen, his war poems and things like that.
Yeah,
I think that's quite common in British schooling. But yeah, there's all those things that you're judging it against, and there's this thing. And sometimes though, you might come up with something saying that this made me feel this way, and you put all of that in and you explain it, and it's not considered wrong because you're allowed to have that subjective interpretation as well, as long as you're picking up the key things that they want you to pick up from
the
it as
themes.
well. Exactly. Um, certain, repetition sounds going like da, 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 da. That's sort of bringing in the sound of machine gun fire whilst they're in the foxholes and all that sort of thing. So, again, that's another standard to compare something against. And you can say that even if you found the poem boring, you can still judge it on the standard. It's still given you that reaction. It's made you picture the field of where everything is happening. So again, it's done its job, and you might have found a slightly different meaning to it too that may not have been the author's intention in the first place. And then that's one of the hard things, though, I find with a lot of art, especially the further you go back. no one really knows the intention of the artist or what they were trying to achieve with it, and so you end up with people arguing over it, and you're just like, oh,
Yeah.
well, who's right there? Nobody knows. Someone probably is, but we don't really know who.
Well, I got into arguments with my English teacher when I was in school because I found William Shakespeare to be incredibly great black comedy. And
Mm-hmm.
he said, "No, you're missing the point." It's like, well, I might be, but it's still incredibly great black comedy. I mean, look at the ending of Romeo and Juliet. If that's not black comedy, I don't know what is.
Mm. Well, yeah,
Sorry.
there's all right. There's always comedy in tragedy, they say anyway. So, um, I think that's one of the things that came up when we were doing a little bit of Shakespeare at school is the fact that there is that dark comedy in there. So I guess maybe it was you, Dave. You changed the minds, and that idea seeped out. And by the time I was studying it, they were like, "Oh yes, yes, black comedy, yes."
I doubt that. I think there's been people interpreting it as comedy for hundreds of
I'm
years.
sure there has as well, but nice to big you up occasionally.
I'm already big. Look at my gut and my huge brain. It's like pushing my hair apart.
So with nature, there isn't really an objective standard. We can talk about the functionality, and we can compare, how good something is at killing, or something like that. We could compare it to art it most resembles. For most scenes, you'd probably go with something like still life. So you can compare it to that standard, but there still isn't an objective standard for nature.
No. Although there's one more thing that could be thrown in here that most atheists won't like, and that's what if it was created by a god? Would him being the creator give it that added intentionality that we can judge something is beautiful from? So has he created the beauty of the sunset to offset the horribleness of a bug laying eggs in a child's eyes?
It's really hard not to switch this into a moral argument.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's the moral argument as well. As if he's designed it to give a certain feeling, and somebody doesn't get that certain feeling, are they judging it wrong because they're just judging it as a wholly natural process rather than a process that's been created by some being with ultimate power?
Yeah. I suppose you could say that if there is that intentionality there, then yeah, we go back to it being like we're talking about our structures. You might not like a Gothic style, but actually you can judge it as a Gothic style. So the only problem there is we don't know if, just presupposing for a moment that there was a god, we don't know what his standard actually is. We don't know what his
Or
standard
what
of
his
each is.
intentions are,
No,
or how he created it. And if he's all powerful, well, then it doesn't really take much skill to
no,
create it.
that's it. So
Yeah.
that we can't appreciate the skill there, because it just happened. So again, it wouldn't be the same as a human, because we're completely fallible and it takes us a lot of time to practice and get ourselves up there. If you're an all-powerful, all-knowing deity, and you go, and it's done. So we can't judge it on the skill that went into it.
And he doesn't even have to think about it. He just has to go create a universe that will make humans that feel sublime feelings at a sunset.
Mm.
And he can't even get it wrong. So
Think he
does
did
that give us, yeah. Would that actually give us a standard to judge nature by? As far as I'm concerned, I would say no.
No. No, unless we were to go with a different kind of god, not the omni god, but if we were to think about it, simulated universe style, a programmer who put it in and programmed our universe. Now, that might not actually be the way it is, but say that there was someone that actually had to consciously think about, they're not perfect, they have a lot more power than us, but they did design each piece, and maybe all the dead planets were all the fuck ups, and that's why there's only one in our solar system with that's got life on it, etc.
Well, it would be a digital sculpture instead of visual painting or, an actual physical marble sculpture.
Mm,
It would be of the same kind of thing, but digital.
yeah,
And we appreciate the beauty that goes into a video game.
yeah,
So,
or some decent CG.
yeah. So, wouldn't that be a similar kind of standard if it was created by a programmer? We
Mm,
could appreciate that skill and what it creates to take a bit of code and make it self-aware.
mm, yeah, so that's just it. So if we basically reduce a deity to a more powerful type human type thing, um, then we could say, well, actually, yeah, there probably was skill. There's look at around us. There's the trial and error. We can judge it against those sort of standards. So yeah, no, that's quite good actually. There is another thing that I think we maybe missed out of nature as well, and it's sort of all the patterns that you see in
The
nature and all
symmetry.
this, yeah, and all the spirals and all that sort of thing. From that perspective, we could have a standard sort of against comparing it to patterns, but then there you go, we're comparing it that to something else that we've created ourselves, aren't we? Though we're
Yeah.
pattern recognition machines, so uh
Well, it's an interesting one, that actually, because it sort of goes back to the god. Imagine like the different type of god. Go with something like the philosopher's god, which is the god of mathematics. The mathematics that exists in the universe is kind of beautiful if you really want to think about it. The fact that it can be modeled, the fact that we can actually understand that it can be modeled is sort of a beautiful thing. But if somebody doesn't find it beautiful because they don't appreciate mass and they say, well, I don't find it beautiful, can you really say, well, you're judging it wrong?
no.
Yeah.
I wanted to think of a yes there, but I couldn't.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it is beautiful, at least to me. It's an amazing thing. And say the universe contains self-aware beings that have arisen out of nothing, basically. Um, Life has emerged from what is essentially non-life. To me, that's kind of a beautiful thing. And it's a category that we can judge it by, but I'm not really sure I could say it's an objective standard that we could judge it by.
No, I'm with you. I agree. uh, so I think that's sort of got us to the point where there isn't really an objective standard that we can compare nature to. The closest we have is comparing it to other things that are similar that we've created ourselves, or as you mentioned with the mathematics. But again,
Yeah, that's it. It's You can say somebody's judging a piece of art wrong because they literally would be judging it incorrectly. Okay, they might not find it beautiful. And even if they knew how to judge it, they might not actually find that beautiful, but they could at least appreciate that
mm,
it is a good piece of artwork. But like you say, there is no such thing in nature because it's missing some of the vital components, like it doesn't have a creator. It's not been designed a particular way. There is no intention to how it looks. It just looks that way. Whereas with art, it's intended to look that way.